Imagine this, a horse standing motionless, right in the middle of a barn, flames shooting up all around it. Smoke swirls in thick clouds, and the heat feels like it could melt the air itself. You'd think the horse would run, wouldn't you? It's the only thing that makes sense when fire is raging all around. But this horse, it doesn't move. It stands there, unwavering, like it's waiting for something powerful, something heroic. This isn't just stubbornness. This is love. This is bravery. The horse's name is Majesty. And in that moment, as the fire crackled and roared, it wasn't running for its life. It was protecting something far more precious than its own safety. Mark, the farmer who had raised Majesty, knew his horse well. He trusted Majesty with his life, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened that night. What started as a quiet evening, calm and peaceful, suddenly turned into a nightmare. Without warning, Mark's barn exploded in flames. The crackling was deafening. The smell of smoke hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His heart raced as he saw the fire spreading quickly, swallowing everything in its path. In an instant, the peaceful night was gone, replaced by chaos and destruction. Mark's first thought was to save his animals, but little did he know it was Majesty's actions that would turn the tide. Mark rushed toward the barn, fear gripping him. But as he neared, something caught his eye, a shadow in the firelight. There, in the midst of the inferno, stood Majesty, frozen, not running, not panicking, just standing. And in that moment, Mark's heart skipped a beat. What was Majesty protecting? Why was this horse refusing to move when every instinct should have screamed to flee? The fire was already intense, the flames licking the sky, the heat unbearable even from a distance. Mark's eyes widened in horror as he realized the worst. His animals were trapped inside. His barn was collapsing, but it was Majesty that had made the decision to stand its ground. As the fire raged, a hidden truth began to surface. Majesty wasn't just standing there out of fear or confusion. It was an act of pure loyalty and courage. And what happened next would change everything. He could hear the frantic sounds of his livestock inside, the panicked snorts and hooves pounding against the barn walls. He didn't know how many of them were still inside, but he couldn't waste time wondering. His first thought was for Majesty. That horse had always been there for him, had saved him in countless ways over the years, and now, in the middle of this disaster, it was Mark's turn to return the favor. Mark dashed forward, his legs feeling heavy as his heart beat erratically in his chest. The fire had spread too quickly, and his mind raced, desperate to get to the barn before it was too late. The barn was already falling apart, the structure groaning under the pressure of the flames. The clock was ticking. He couldn't afford to waste a single second. But as the flames roared louder and closer, Mark's mind was consumed by one question. Was Majesty okay? Mark's boots pounded against the earth as he sprinted toward the barn, the heat from the fire biting at his skin, making every step feel like an eternity. His breath was coming in ragged gasps, and the thick smoke made it nearly impossible to see. But he couldn't afford to stop. His mind was focused solely on his animals, especially Majesty, the horse he had raised and cared for since she was a foal. As he neared the barn, he shouted desperately, his voice hoarse from the smoke, "Get out! Move! Get out of there!" But his calls were met with terrified silence. The animals were confused, disoriented by the thick smoke and the overwhelming heat. They were trapped in a haze of fear, unsure of what to do in the chaos surrounding them. Mark's heart raced as he fumbled with the barn door, his hands shaking from both panic and the unbearable heat. Finally, he wrenched it open, pushing through the smoke that immediately hit him like a brick wall. The air was thick, burning his lungs with every breath. Yet he pushed on, not thinking of his own discomfort, only thinking about the creatures he loved and needed to save. He staggered into the barn, his eyes burning as the smoke stung his vision. The sound of crackling flames filled his ears, but his attention was laser-focused on the stalls. One by one, he checked each stall, yelling for the animals to move, praying they would make it out in time. Then, Mark reached Majesty's stall. His heart skipped a beat when he saw her standing there, completely still, unshaken by the flames that were now so close. Her coat glowed in the dim orange light of the fire, her mane slightly singed from the heat. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. They were fixed on something in the back of the barn, a gaze so intense that Mark had to stop in his tracks. "Majesty!" Mark called, pulling at her reins, trying to get her to move, but she didn't budge. She remained frozen, her body tense, her attention locked on the far end of the barn where the smoke and flames swirled together in an ominous dance. Mark tugged harder, his hands slipping slightly from the sweat and soot covering them, but still, the horse didn't move. He was used to Majesty being stubborn at times, but this was different. She wasn't panicking or trying to escape, she was protecting something. He could see it in the way she stood, as though she was guarding something behind her, despite the raging fire closing in around them. As the heat intensified, Mark's mind raced. What was she looking at? Why wouldn't she move? The barn was falling apart, and time was running out. But Majesty's unyielding stance suggested something was more important to her than her own safety. And Mark, in that moment, felt a spark of realization. There was something hidden in the back of the barn, and it was in danger. Mark's heart thudded wildly in his chest as he pulled fiercely at Majesty's reins, his hands slick with sweat and soot. "Come on, girl! We need to go now!" he yelled, his voice strained with desperation. But Majesty didn't move, not an inch. She stood there, planted firmly on the ground, her hooves dug into the hay-covered floor. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, remained locked on the farthest corner of the barn, as if there was something far more important to her than escaping the fire. The smoke was thickening, the heat intensifying, and yet the horse made no move to leave. Mark's frustration flared. He knew Majesty. She wasn't a coward. She had always been one of the most reliable animals on the farm. So why now, in the face of certain danger, was she refusing to move? Every other animal Mark had called for was already outside the barn, running to safety or escaping through the back door. The chaos outside was palpable. He could hear the sounds of panic, the clattering hooves of horses fleeing, and the distant cries of the other animals. But Majesty, his trusted horse, the one he thought he could always count on, was standing still, almost as though she was waiting for something. The barn, now fully engulfed in flames, groaned and creaked under the stress of the fire. The roof was beginning to collapse in spots, sending fiery debris crashing to the ground. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the thick, acrid smoke stung his eyes, making it harder to see. Mark's thoughts began to race. Could he really get Majesty out of here in time? The fire was closing in fast, and there wasn't much more time to waste. A surge of panic flooded over him as he glanced at the collapsing structure around them. The smoke was suffocating, the flames licking at the wooden beams just above their heads. Mark's mind screamed that they needed to get out. Now! Yet Majesty stood resolutely, unyielding in her place, staring at something in the distance. Mark's breath hitched as he realized the gravity of the situation. While the barn crumbled, and with every second that passed, the fire grew stronger, Majesty was not only refusing to leave, she was staying for a reason. The question rang out in Mark's mind. What was she protecting? Mark's eyes flicked between the fire raging around them and Majesty's unwavering stance. Her head was held high, her ears forward, her entire body locked in place as though she were guarding something. He followed her gaze to the back corner of the barn, where the smoke was thickest, but where Majesty's eyes never wavered. There was something there, something that had captured her attention, and it was not the fire, the heat, or the chaos surrounding them. The sound of the flames crackling loudly in his ears, Mark strained to listen for anything unusual. He had always been keen on the sounds of the barn, the creaks of the wood, the rustling of hay, the gentle snorts of the animals. But now, in the midst of the chaos, a different sound began to reach his ears. Soft, faint, almost imperceptible over the roar of the flames. A whimper. A soft, high-pitched cry, barely audible above the noise of the fire. Mark froze for a moment, his heart skipping a beat. He turned toward the source of the sound, his mind racing. Could it be an animal? His stomach churned as a sense of dread washed over him. The sound came again, more distinct this time. A weak, pleading sound, like something in pain or distress. His eyes widened in realization. It was coming from the back of the barn, exactly where Majesty's gaze was fixed. Mark's pulse quickened as the fire continued to rage closer, but his focus remained on the sound and the horse. He took a cautious step toward the back of the barn, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground, the smoke suffocating. Every breath felt like it was the last, but there was no turning back. The noise was undeniable now. A soft cry mixed with the faint sound of something small struggling. Majesty let out a soft, low nicker as Mark drew closer, her body visibly tensing. Mark was filled with a sudden, overwhelming sense of urgency. What was she protecting? The possibility that someone was in danger hit him like a freight train. He had to get to the source, and quickly. But as the fire crackled louder and the smoke thickened, Mark's every instinct screamed at him to hurry. Whatever Majesty was guarding, it wasn't safe. It was trapped. A chill ran through Mark's spine as the realization sank in. There was something in that corner, something helpless. Mark's heart raced as he stumbled toward the back of the barn, the smoke thickening and the heat pressing down on him with every step. He could barely see through the haze, but his ears were focused on the faint cries echoing through the barn. Majesty's gaze remained fixed, her body tense and unmoving, and Mark's feet moved faster as the desperation in his chest grew. Finally, he reached the corner where the sound was coming from, and the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Amidst the collapsing walls and blazing inferno, there in the farthest corner of the barn was a small, trembling foal. Its tiny body was curled in a desperate attempt to escape the flames that were creeping dangerously close, but it was too weak to move, too frightened to find a way out. Its legs were unsteady, and it could barely lift its head, its tiny body covered in cuts and bruises from the panic-stricken scramble to escape. Mark froze for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. The foal was barely conscious, struggling to even rise. The sight was overwhelming, but what shook him to his core wasn't just the sight of the helpless foal. It was the realization of what Majesty had been doing all along. The horse he had always trusted, the horse he had known to be loyal and strong, was not standing still out of fear or stubbornness. She was standing guard. Majesty's wide, protective stance was not just an act of defiance to the fire, but an act of selflessness, a shield between the foal and the raging flames. Mark's eyes filled with disbelief. Majesty had been shielding the foal from the fire all this time. Every inch of her body had been a barrier against the inferno, preventing the flames from reaching the vulnerable, fragile creature. The puzzle pieces finally clicked together in Mark's mind. Majesty hadn't been unwilling to leave the barn. She had refused to leave the foal. It was clear now, she wasn't acting out of fear or stubbornness. She was acting out of an unshakable instinct to protect the foal, her natural bond to it guiding her every move. With his heart pounding, Mark could hardly process the depth of Majesty's bravery. He hadn't known what to expect when he ran into the barn. He had feared the worst. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Majesty was more than just a horse to him. She was a protector, a silent guardian willing to put herself in harm's way for something even weaker than herself. But there was no time to dwell on the shock of it. Mark's mind quickly shifted to the urgent task ahead. The foal needed to be saved, and Majesty had made it clear that she would do whatever it took to ensure its survival. It was time to act. As Mark stared at Majesty, the truth of the situation began to sink in. The puzzle pieces he hadn't been able to connect, her refusal to leave, her unwavering stance in the face of the fire, suddenly made perfect sense. Majesty wasn't just standing still because she was scared or confused. No, this was something far more profound. Her actions weren't born of fear, but of an overwhelming, deep protective instinct. She wasn't protecting herself from the fire. She was protecting the foal, the helpless little creature that was struggling to survive, too young and weak to escape the encroaching flames. Majesty had taken it upon herself to become its shield, placing her body between the fire and the foal. The fierce loyalty Mark had always admired in her had taken on an entirely new, heroic dimension. Mark's heart swelled with pride, and a wave of admiration washed over him. He had always known Majesty was loyal, always knew that she would stand by him when times were tough. But this was beyond what he could have imagined. She wasn't just a horse anymore. She was a protector, a savior in the truest sense. She was willing to face death, to risk everything, to keep this tiny, defenseless foal safe from harm. For a moment, Mark simply stood there, taking it all in. The fire raged around them, but he was lost in the connection between the two animals. Majesty, the strong, loyal horse, and the foal, a helpless baby she had taken under her wing without hesitation. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the bond that had formed between them. A bond that transcended species, one that was woven together by trust, love, and an instinctive drive to protect. Mark had witnessed many moments of bravery in his life, but this was something beyond ordinary courage. Majesty was risking everything, not just for the foal's survival, but because her heart had led her to make that choice. It was an incredible sight, and as much as Mark's mind screamed that he needed to act quickly, his heart couldn't help but feel a deep sense of awe at the bond between these two creatures. In that moment, Mark realized something that would stay with him forever. Majesty wasn't just saving the foal. In a way, she was saving them both. Her bravery, her selflessness, it was giving him a chance to rescue them both from the flames. Without her, the foal would be lost, and he wouldn't have been able to make it out of the barn in time. Her strength was his strength. Her courage was his hope. Time was running out, but Mark couldn't help but marvel at the incredible bond between them all. The connection between human, horse, and foal, one that went beyond the animal kingdom, was clearer than ever. Majesty's willingness to risk her life was proof of that. It was more than just instinct. It was love, and it was stronger than any fire. The seconds felt like hours as Mark stood frozen, watching the fire consume the barn with terrifying speed. The once sturdy wooden beams were groaning under the heat, crackling and splintering as the flames spread relentlessly. The air was thick with smoke, stinging his eyes and making it harder to breathe. The ground beneath his feet was warm, the heat searing through his boots. He could feel the structure of the barn shuddering, as if it were on the brink of collapsing entirely. Mark's heart raced. Time was running out, and with every passing moment, the fire grew more intense, more dangerous. The barn, once a place of safety for his animals, was now a ticking time bomb. He could hear the fire roaring louder, the sound of burning timber and crackling flames drowning out everything else. The barn was crumbling, and with it, his chances of making it out alive. But the real question, the one that twisted his gut, was whether he could save them both, Majesty and the foal. His mind was racing, his thoughts chaotic. There was no time for second-guessing, no room for hesitation. He had to act, and he had to act now. His eyes darted between Majesty, standing resolutely as the flames closed in around them, and the foal, still trapped and too weak to move. Every instinct in him screamed to rush out, to get away from the fire, but he couldn't leave them behind. He couldn't just walk away from the creatures who depended on him. Not now, not after everything Majesty had done to protect the foal. He glanced toward the back of the barn. The exit was blocked, the flames too close to make it out safely that way. The other side? No better. His only option was to move fast and take the dangerous route, the one closest to the fire's fury. A cold sweat covered his forehead as he made his decision. There was no other choice. He had to try. He would do everything in his power to get them both out of here, Majesty and the Foal. He wasn't going to let them down. With a deep breath, Mark lunged forward, grabbing Majesty's reins with both hands. The horse, sensing the urgency in his movements, finally moved with him. But it wasn't enough. He still had to get the foal. He rushed to the back of the barn, his body forced to fight through the thick smoke and heat, praying he wasn't too late. As the barn continued to collapse around him, Mark's heart pounded in his chest. There was no time to waste. He bent down beside the foal, lifting it carefully into his arms. He could feel the tiny creature's fragile body trembling, but he didn't waste time trying to comfort it. Every second counted. With one last glance at Majesty, who was standing at the edge of the barn, her eyes fixed on him with unspoken trust, Mark made his way to the small exit. His legs burned with exhaustion, his lungs screamed for air, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close. He pushed forward through the smoke, feeling the heat grow unbearable. The barn's walls creaked, and the beams groaned as they began to bend under the weight of the fire. But somehow they kept moving. Majesty, the Foal, and Mark, together, making their way toward safety. The moment Mark stepped out of the barn's crumbling doorway, the air hit him like a wave, fresh and cool compared to the stifling heat inside. He didn't stop to catch his breath. He kept moving, running as fast as he could, carrying the foal and guiding Majesty along with him. There was no time to celebrate yet. The barn was still burning behind him, and he wasn't sure how long the flames would chase them. But for now, they were alive. He had made it, and the choice he had made, to risk it all to save them both, had worked. The fire's roar behind them was deafening, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. Mark's pulse was hammering in his ears as he carefully lifted the foal into his arms, its frail body trembling against him. Every instinct told him to hurry, but there was no room for mistakes. The barn was rapidly becoming a death trap. Every beam that once supported its sturdy frame now groaned and cracked under the relentless heat. The fire was closing in, creeping forward with terrifying speed. Mark grabbed Majesty's reins, his hands shaking from the heat and the weight of the situation. The horse stood firmly by his side, as if fully aware of the stakes. Her steady, calming presence was a small comfort in the chaos. But the path ahead was anything but certain. The heat was unbearable. Mark could feel the fire's breath, hot and suffocating, pushing against his skin like a wave. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but there was no time to stop. The flames licked at the edges of the barn, crackling and snapping, growing louder with every passing second. Each step Mark took was one step closer to the unknown, and the risk of collapse was ever present. They moved cautiously, stepping around charred timbers and dodging falling beams that threatened to crush them. Mark's legs burned with exertion, each movement becoming more difficult as the thick smoke clogged his throat. He could barely see through the haze, and the air tasted like ash, hot and acrid. He wiped his brow, but it only made the smoke sting harder. Still, he pushed on, never once faltering. Majesty moved with surprising calm, her strong hooves thudding against the floor as she followed Mark's every move. The foal, limp in his arms, seemed oblivious to the danger, its small body shaking. Mark whispered reassurances to it, though he wasn't sure if it could hear him over the deafening crackle of the fire. Time was slipping away, and the barn felt as if it were alive, groaning with every minute. The walls seemed to be closing in, as if the fire itself was trying to force them into a corner. Mark's thoughts raced. Every second counted. He needed to get to the exit. He needed to save them. With a glance over his shoulder, he saw the flames, their orange tongues stretching higher, closer to the path they needed to take. The fire was relentless, a force of nature that cared nothing for their survival. But Mark couldn't stop. There was no other choice. Every step they took, the danger seemed to grow. He had to duck under a low-hanging beam, carefully maneuvering around a fallen piece of wood. The fire was everywhere now, and it was almost impossible to tell where the smoke ended and the flames began. Mark's throat burned with every breath, but he didn't stop moving. The exit was in sight, a faint sliver of light ahead, a promise of safety, but between them and the way out lay a sea of fire, the walls threatening to collapse at any moment. Mark's heart raced even faster, the adrenaline pushing him to keep going. The barn creaked again, louder this time, and a large beam fell with a deafening crash just to their right. Mark barely had time to react, jumping back with Majesty and the Foal. His pulse skyrocketed as he realized how close they had come to being trapped. But they couldn't stop now. They had to push through. The barn's walls were shaking, the structure no longer able to withstand the inferno. He felt the air grow hotter with each step, and his legs were growing weaker. But the light up ahead, the open space, kept him going. Finally, with a deep, strained breath, Mark surged forward, his body aching with exhaustion, but his will stronger than ever. Majesty trotted beside him, the foal held tightly in his arms, both of them moving as fast as they could through the inferno. The fire's crackling grew louder as they neared the exit, and the heat seemed to claw at his back, but they were so close now. One more step. Mark's heart leaped in his chest as they passed the final line of flame, emerging into the cool night air. He didn't stop. He kept moving, pushing forward into the safety of the open field. As they cleared the barn's perimeter, Mark collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his lungs burning, but they had made it. They were out. In that moment, as the flames continued to rage behind them, Mark looked down at the foal in his arms and Majesty by his side. He had done it. Against all odds, they had escaped. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as they neared the barn's exit. The path ahead was finally clear, the smoke thinning, and the cool night air just beyond the door seemed like salvation. But the barn had other plans. As if mocking their desperate attempt at escape, a terrifying groan reverberated through the wooden structure. The walls seemed to tremble, the very foundation giving way under the weight of the raging fire. Mark's blood ran cold as he glanced up. Cracks were forming in the roof, beams twisting and warping as the fire ate away at the structure. He didn't have time to think. The barn's timbers groaned louder, and then, with a horrific screech, the first large beam above them buckled. Mark's pulse spiked. There was no more time. They were trapped between the flames and falling debris. He gripped the foal tighter, instinctively pulling Majesty forward. But it wasn't enough. The barn was coming down. The air seemed to hold its breath as the next beam cracked, falling toward them. Mark's legs felt like jelly, his mind racing through a dozen possible escape plans, each more impossible than the last. The sound of falling debris echoed louder, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. And then, in an instant, the final beam came crashing down, its weight threatening to obliterate everything in its path. Mark's heart skipped a beat. They were too close. But just as the beam crashed to the ground with a deafening roar, Majesty, who had been standing steady by his side, ever calm through the chaos, surged forward with unbelievable strength. With a powerful tug, the horse pulled them away from the imminent danger, her muscles straining with the effort. It was as if she knew the collapse was coming, and in that split second, she acted on pure instinct. Mark stumbled forward just as the entire barn seemed to collapse inward behind them. The ground shook, and the final disastrous crash of the roof sent plumes of smoke and debris into the air. Mark's heart raced as the heat and sound of the explosion rushed toward them, but Majesty didn't stop. She kept moving, her hooves pounding against the ground as she led them through the final stretch of safety. With one last powerful tug, Majesty led Mark, the foal still in his arms, clear of the barn's ruins. They barely made it. The barn, once a place of shelter and safety, was now nothing but a smoldering ruin reduced to ashes and rubble in the blink of an eye. Mark's breath was shallow, his legs weak, but they had made it. They were out. As he glanced over his shoulder, the barn was a mass of flames and smoke, the night sky lit by the destruction they had narrowly escaped. Majesty, though exhausted, stood tall beside him, her steadfast eyes reflecting the courage that had saved them both. Mark felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude. Without her, they would never have made it out in time. Mark, Majesty, and the foal tumbled out of the barn just in time, their bodies crashing into the soft ground beyond the destruction. The roar of the fire was deafening behind them, the flames now licking at the remains of the barn, but they were no longer in its path. Covered in soot and smoke, their clothes torn and their lungs burning from the acrid air, they were alive. Mark could barely comprehend the weight of the moment. He lay on the ground for a heartbeat, gasping for air, his eyes locked on Majesty. The horse stood just a few feet away, trembling but standing tall, her mane matted and her coat covered in ash. The foal, though weak and still struggling to move, was safely nestled against Mark's side, protected by Majesty's unyielding shield of love and bravery. The fire raged on, sending embers into the night sky, but the destruction was now behind them. Mark looked up at the barn, which had once been a safe place, a place where his life's work and his animals had thrived. Now, it was nothing but a fiery skeleton, collapsing in on itself. The inferno was consuming everything in its path, but for Mark, Majesty, and the foal, the danger was over. For a long moment, Mark didn't speak. His hands were still shaking, his heart still racing. He had been seconds away from losing everything, his farm, his animals, and the one horse who had stood by him through it all. As he took a breath, the weight of the near disaster began to sink in. They had scraped through by sheer miracle. Majesty, in her bravery and determination, had made sure they didn't just survive, but escaped with their lives. The bond between them had deepened in that moment, a bond forged in fire, a bond of unshakable loyalty and trust. Looking at Majesty now, Mark realized something. This wasn't just the horse who had worked by his side for years. This was the horse who had saved him, who had risked everything for the ones she loved, and for that, he would never be the same. He whispered softly, more to himself than to her. "Thank you, Majesty. I owe you everything." The night was quiet now, save for the crackling of the distant fire, the only reminder of what they had just survived. But in that stillness, Mark knew one thing with absolute certainty. The bond between them was unbreakable. What they had just lived through together had sealed it for life. As the fire was finally contained, the smoke slowly began to clear, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The once thriving barn was now a charred ruin, reduced to embers and broken beams. The crisp night air felt cooler now, though it did nothing to ease the weight in Mark's chest. He stood just outside the wreckage, his gaze fixed on the glowing remnants of the fire. Majesty stood beside him, her body still shaking from the ordeal, but her eyes soft and steady. The foal, though weak, was tucked safely against her side, recovering under Mark's watchful care. As the adrenaline of the escape faded, Mark's thoughts turned inward. The rush of fear and survival had given way to deep reflection. He couldn't help but replay the events of that terrifying night in his mind. Majesty, standing firm in the face of danger, never once wavering in her determination. He had thought she was simply frozen in fear, but now he saw it clearly. Majesty wasn't scared. She wasn't being stubborn or defiant. She was acting out of a love so deep it transcended instinct. Her refusal to leave, her unwavering stance in the midst of chaos, had been an act of pure selfless heroism. In that moment, Majesty had become more than just an animal. She had become his protector, his savior. Mark's heart tightened as he pondered what could have happened if Majesty hadn't acted the way she did. What if she had run with the others, like the rest of the animals? The foal would have been left behind, trapped and vulnerable. The barn would have collapsed before Mark had a chance to reach the back, and the fire would have claimed them both. The thought was enough to make his stomach churn. He had come so close to losing everything, his home, his animals, and most of all, his faithful companion. Majesty had truly saved them both. In the face of overwhelming danger, when it would have been so easy to panic, she had held her ground. Mark looked down at the horse beside him, a wave of gratitude flooding over him. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. In that moment, Mark knew with certainty that their bond was something far beyond the human-animal connection he had always believed it to be. It was a bond forged in moments of crisis, in selfless acts of love and loyalty. Majesty had risked her life without a second thought, not just for the foal, but for him as well. Mark reached out, gently stroking her mane, feeling the warmth of her body beneath his fingers. "You're more than just a horse, Majesty," he murmured, his heart full. "You're my hero." As the night wore on and the fire was reduced to nothing but glowing embers, Mark reflected on the true nature of heroism. It wasn't always in grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Sometimes it was simply standing still in the face of danger, refusing to leave the ones you love, no matter the cost. Majesty had taught him that, and as he stood there by her side, with the foal safe in his arms, Mark knew that no matter what the future held, this bond, this extraordinary unspoken understanding between them, would carry them through anything. The dawn slowly broke over the farm, casting a gentle light over the charred remains of the barn. It was a sobering sight, a reminder of the night's devastation, but also of the miracle that had occurred within these very walls. The barn may have burned to the ground, but Mark's heart felt lighter than it had in hours. Majesty, the horse that had always been more than just an animal to him, stood by his side as if nothing had happened, though Mark knew better. Her coat was smeared with ash, her eyes tired from the ordeal, but there was something unmistakably regal about her still. She had faced the fire, not as a frightened creature, but as a fierce protector, and in doing so had saved both the foal and him. As he looked over at her, Mark's chest swelled with gratitude. This wasn't just the horse who had worked hard on his farm for years. No, Majesty was something far more precious now. She was a true hero. Through the chaos and destruction, she had not only preserved her own life, but had made sure the foal would have a chance to grow up. She had acted out of a love and loyalty Mark had never quite understood until now. The sound of soft footsteps broke his reverie, and Mark looked down to see the foal. The small creature, though still wobbly, was attempting its first steps. At first it stumbled, its tiny legs not quite sure how to support its weight, but with each attempt, it grew steadier. Mark smiled softly, his heart warmed by the sight. It wasn't just a miracle of survival, it was the beginning of something new. Majesty, with the foal close by her side, watched intently as it tried to walk. Her body was still, but her eyes were full of pride and protectiveness. As the foal steadied itself and took another step, Mark could see the bond between the two animals, just as deep as the one he shared with Majesty. The foal was no longer helpless. It was learning to stand, thanks to the protection and strength that Majesty had offered in those precious moments of crisis. Mark couldn't help but feel a tear slip down his cheek. The farm had changed, yes. There was much to rebuild, much to restore. But the heart of it, the spirit of the land, had been strengthened. The relationship between him, Majesty, and the foal had deepened beyond measure, forged in fire, in bravery, and in a shared bond of survival. Sitting on the ground next to Majesty, Mark leaned against her, watching the foal's progress with a proud smile. He could see the future now, full of hope and renewal. They would rebuild the barn, the animals would flourish again, and together they would carry on as a family. As the foal took another shaky step, Mark looked at Majesty and whispered, "You've given us both a second chance." He ran his hand gently down her neck. "I'll never forget what you did for us." Majesty nickered softly in response, as if she understood every word. And as they sat there, side by side, Mark knew in his heart that the bond between him and Majesty, and between her and the foal, was something that could never be broken. Through the fire, through the fear, and through it all, they had come out stronger, together.